welcome back to the Lowell Area Historical Museum Immersion Online program. This activity is called Builder of Museums, and we're going to be learning today a little bit about this man in the portrait behind me. His name is Ernest Graham, and while he's an older gentleman in this picture, he actually grew up in the building that is now Lowell's museum as a child. His father, Robert Graham, built the home when Ernest was about 6 years old. Ernest was said to have helped his dad build the house, and it may have sparked a lifelong interest in becoming an architect. Ernest Graham grew up in the building. He was, as I mentioned, about 6 years old when he moved in with a brother and a sister, and was soon joined by three other siblings and a new baby brother. So there were 7 kids that grew up in this museum building all together. Ernest had a long interest in building, and when he was a teenager, he went to Grand Rapids and became an apprentice and started learning how to build big buildings. He moved shortly thereafter to Chicago, where in 1893 he helped to build something called the Chicago World's Fair, or the Columbian World's Fair. Now, World Fairs were really big deals. Countries would, kind of like the Olympics, try to be the one that got to host the World's Fair. A previous one had been held in Paris, and there they built the Eiffel Tower as part of the World's Fair. So big landmarks and big productions were part of building the World's Fair. Ernest, as a young man, went down right before this fair began and was hired by a man named Daniel Burnham, who was in charge of building the Columbian World's Fair in Chicago. So Ernest got a lot of experience helping to build this giant fair in Chicago. When the fair was done, he and Daniel Burnham became partners and began building buildings together. They were particularly well known for building skyscrapers and large public buildings. So you may actually know some of the buildings that Ernest Graham built that are still around today. One of them, I'm going to show you a picture here. This is the building that Daniel Burnham had Ernest Graham build for the World's Fair, and it's currently the Science and Industry Museum in Chicago. Some of the buildings that they built after the World's Fair that you might be familiar with include the Shedd Aquarium in Chicago, and also the Field Museum in Chicago. Ernest Graham and his family were always interested in history. And the fact that Daniel Burnham and Ernest Graham helped to build some of our nation's biggest museums is really no surprise. He was an architect for many, many years. He built many, many buildings all around America and England, and was one of America's most well-known architects. And he grew up right here in Lowell in the building that's now the museum. So what we want to do today is think about museums and how they look, and how what they do influences how they look. So some of the buildings that we showed you by Ernest Graham are built in what's called a classical style. They look very regal and impressive and big. There's lots of white columns, kind of a symmetrical looking building. But not all museums look that way. Check out this museum. This is a museum in Minnesota, and it obviously looks quite different from the one built by Ernest Graham. This is an art museum, and you can tell just by looking at it that it is quite a different style, very artistic, and very different. This is a museum here in Michigan, and it looks quite a bit like a garage, doesn't it? This is the Gilmore Car Museum in Michigan, and the mission of this museum is to tell the history of automobiles. This museum is out in Philadelphia, and it's a museum of the American Revolution. A lot of the buildings in this area in that time period were built out of red brick, and they've used that same red brick for their museum building to reflect some of what the stories inside the museum tell. Some museums talk about time periods like the American Revolution. Some talk about regions or areas of the world, like the Lowell Area Museum talks about the history of the Lowell area. Some museums talk about topics. So we have car museums, we have museums about magic, and other museums can be house museums. So they might be homes of famous people. Does anyone recognize this home? This is Mount Vernon, which was the home of our first president, George Washington. There can be all kinds of museums. There are museums about fashion. There are museums about different topics. There are museums about baseball. There are museums about art or specific artists. There are many, many different types of museums. And what the museum is about influences what's inside the museum. So here at the Lowell Museum, we collect and tell the stories of the Lowell area. So in our museum, we don't have things that relate to Washington, D.C. or Europe. What we have here are things that relate to the stories that tell what happened here in Lowell. Well, for today, for your activity, what we would like you to do is to design your own museum. So what I want you to do is pause our video, and I'm gonna ask you to go find some paper and something to draw with, whether it's just a pencil and paper or crayons or colored pencils. Whatever you have at home is completely fine. So pause me for a moment, go ahead and get your items, and then come back. Okay, thank you. So now that you have something to draw with, what I want you to do is I want you to think about if you could create any type of museum that you would like, what would it be? Would it be a museum about your favorite sport? Would it be a museum about unicorns? Would it be a museum about art? Would it be a museum about science? What would your museum be about? It can be about anything you would like. So think about that for just a second. Think about what you want your museum to be about. And then I want you to think about what you would name your museum. All right. So now that you know what you want your museum to be about and what its name is, I want you to think about what kind of building will your museum be in. And on your paper, you're going to draw a picture of the outside of your museum. And don't forget to put the name of your museum on the outside. And then on the other side of your paper, I want you to draw something that we would see if we came to your museum. It can be the layout of the building. It could be a specific exhibit within your building. Or it could be an item that's in your building. Maybe you have the world's most amazing painting by somebody. So maybe you just want to show us a picture of that painting. Whatever it is, I want you to think about something that would be inside your museum, and then draw us a picture of that and draw us a picture of the outside. I'm going to show you an example here of a museum that my daughter drew for us. This is a museum of authors. And so for her picture, she has two fancy lions on the outside of the museum and a big set of staircases. So she's got kind of a classical building going here. And then she's got the ticket windows and a gift shop. And then on the second floor, there are more exhibits about authors, and she's got different books that they've written, and then she has the name across the top. So you can do this in just pencil and paper. You can get creative, and if you have colored pencils or crayons or paints, however you would like to do it. But I want you to think about if you could share a museum with the world right now, what would it be, and what would be inside it? And then you can take a picture of it and send it to your teacher or share it here with us at the museum. And we'd love to see what you can come up with to share a different idea for a museum with us. This ends our museum builder activity. The rest of the time is yours to draw and create your museum. As we end, I would like to once again thank our sponsors, the Michigan Council for Arts and Cultural Affairs and the Literacy Legacy Fund of Michigan, and your teachers and principals for bringing this program to you and letting us share some of what the museum has to offer with you. Thank you.